My name is Sister Marie Mackey. I am the Director of Campus Ministry for St. Joseph's College on the Brooklyn campus. And we are delighted to have with us today Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood and Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester, who will be part of a panel to talk about the Sisters of St. Joseph and the civil rights movement. I'm going to begin with just a brief bio on each of our panelists, and I'm going to begin with Sister Kathy Navarra. Sister Kathy has worked with the Fathers of St. Edmund for 20 years. They're also known as the Edmundites, and they have St. Michael's College in Colchester, Vermont, and Enders Island, which is a retreat place. Kathy has lived in rural sites of Pine Apple and Verdenberg, and now lives in Selma. She supervises 2 rural after-school programs, as well as an 8th through 10th grade after-school program in Selma. In addition, Sister Kathy has been doing community outreach by supervising their 2 food pantries and running 3 thrift stores. Her ministries in Rochester, New York included soup kitchen, parish work, and teaching. So we welcome Sister Kathy.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Sister Donna Delsanto, who I've pretty much known since my own days in formation. She came as a guest speaker. Donna entered the Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester in 1992 and has served her congregation as Director of Vocations since 2003. Sister Donna began and continues to coordinate the Sisters of St. Joseph Volunteer Corps that she began in 1996. And through this program, over 1,000 youth have lived with the Sisters of St. Joseph in an intentional community and served in a variety of ministries with people on the margins. Sister Donna is a public health nurse and has served the rural poor in the mountains of Kentucky. Today she works as a nurse 1 day a week at the Monroe County Jail. She has brought youth and young adults to the border in El Paso, Texas, Selma, Alabama, and many other poor communities. And I could go on and on about Sister Donna as well. But we welcome her with us today. So thank you, Donna, for joining us. I'd like to also welcome Virginia Dowd. Virginia Dowd is the archivist for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood. She has degrees in systematic theology from Fordham and an MLIS from Long Island University. She's worked with the Passionist community in their communications office as a college librarian. And since 2009, we have been blessed to have her as our archivist. Virginia is a married mother of 4 daughters and 3 grandsons. So thank you, Virginia, for joining us. Sister Regina Kahl, Sister of St. Joseph of Brentwood, was born and raised in Brooklyn. Regina shared a story with me that her mother loved the Sisters of St. Joseph so much that the family intentionally moved to a parish that had the Sisters of St. Joseph. She went to Bishop McDonald High School, where she once again had the Sisters of St. Joseph as her teachers. Upon her graduation, she entered the community. That was 74 years ago. Sister Regina has taught on every grade level. After completing a doctorate in religion from Columbia, Sister Regina was invited to be at the University of Notre Dame to teach pastoral ministry. She remained there for 20 years, and at this time she is retired at Stella Maris, one of our living with assistance houses. So we welcome Regina, and again, thank you for being a part of this. And Sister Barbara Lum. Sister Barbara grew up in the city of Rochester, just a few blocks from the thriving Eastman Kodak Company. She had the Sisters of St. Joseph in elementary and high school, and then entered the community in 1953. A graduate of Nazareth College with a BS in nursing, she ministered at Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma, Alabama from 1959 to 1968. The Sisters of St. Joseph served African American patients and ran a school of practical nursing. In the segregated South, Good Samaritan was the only hospital for many miles and in several counties which served people of color. In 1965, she was privileged to be in Selma to care for the many civil rights marchers who were injured in the sheriff and state trooper violence, which met the nonviolent marchers. Sister Barbara later became a women's health nurse practitioner and worked for more than 20 years at the University School of Nursing and Clinics. Again, I could go on forever. At this time, Barbara volunteers at a drop-in center. So again, we thank all of you for being part of this panel today and for St. Joseph's College hosting this. Aware that there might be people on this Zoom call who are not, don't have a background in our history. The Sisters of St. Joseph were founded in 1650 in Le Puy, France. They came to America, to St. Louis, in 1836, and from there moved all around to the different territories and states. The Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester and the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, we are all from the same founder and foundress. We are all from the same bloodline. But we minister, some of us as diocesan, and some of us minister across a number of states. So you may notice sometimes you'll see C.S.J, which is the Brentwood initials, and S.S.J, but we are all Sisters of St. Joseph. So again, a welcome. I'd like to ask Sister Barbara Lum to start us off to talk about the Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester and their mission and ministry to the people of Selma in Alabama. So Sister Barbara, please enlighten us.
All right, I'll start in 1943, or 1940. Reverend Mother Rosemarium Smith was the overall the head of our congregation in Rochester, and she had conversations around that time with the priest who was the leader of the propagation of faith in from Rochester, and he had recently been in contact with the director of the founder of the Edmonite missions and in Selma. And so these conversations were almost serendipitous, at least the way the history reads. And they fulfilled a long-time dream of Mother Rosemarium of sending our sisters to work with people of color in the South in poor areas, which Selma defined perfectly, I think. So the sisters went with the blessing of Bishop Carney from Rochester and Archbishop Tulin from Alabama. 5 sisters arrived in Selma in 1940 and began with help from the Edmonites to meet with people and see what their needs were. So they particularly established themselves with neighbors in East Selma, a very, very poor Black neighborhood, and found out from them what they wanted most was education for their children. So the sisters began grade by grade building a grade school. And they also taught many adults to read, and they also had many converts to Catholicism. And one woman said after a flood in the 50s in Selma, the Alabama River overflowed, and the people living along the bottom were the poorest people, the people of color. And so the sisters really went down there and brought them supplies, brought them up to the convent and parish area and helped them, provided meals and provided shelter for a time. And one woman said of them, if this is what the sisters are like, if this is what Catholics are like, I want to become a Catholic. And she and her family became Catholic. Their children then came to St. Elizabeth School run by the sisters. And so that kind of work, I mean, they just saw what was needed and started. And they also became aware of, and the Edmondites were very aware of, a place called Holy Infant Inn, which was a very, very poor shelter for elderly people. That I think the doctors, white doctors of Selma, were the ones sort of staffing it. And ultimately, that building was torn down and they moved into a different building, and many buildings, several buildings anyway, were built with the support of fundraising from the Edmondites. So when I arrived in 1960, there was a hospital that there was a newer hospital that was quite nice, open wards, but brick and with tile floors. And there was an older hospital that still housed the operating room, and the School of Practical Nursing was there, which had been started after the hospital. The School of Practical Nursing in 1945 or 1950 graduated their first class. And the old hospital, in the room where I taught nursing arts, you could see through the floorboards to the ground below, and it was very poor. And the operating room was in that same building. The sterile supplies, all of those things, were until the construction actually of a brand new, beautiful hospital in 1964. Um, both those buildings were operative, and a nursing home had been built that was, again, quite nice, state of the art, 26 bed home for senior citizens, most of whom had come from very impoverished backgrounds. So the sisters staffed the hospital. Our licensed practical nurses also staffed the hospital, and most of the physicians were white doctors who cared for their colored patients in our hospital and their white patients in another hospital. It was the Selma Baptist Hospital, which the doctors owned. Um, so let me just see. In the early days um, of the sisters' presence there in the Edmondites, the Ku Klux Klan let them know that they were aware of them with signs or messages that said, the KKK is looking at you. But as far as I've ever heard, no property was damaged. It was just sort of meant to intimidate, which I don't think it did I don't think it was taken very seriously by the Edmondites or the sisters. And the white population, I think in general, at least my impression was that they knew we were there. We were doing some work maybe that nobody else wanted to do, and they left us. So we were there and they were in their place, and separate but equal was the standard of the segregated South at that time. So we did not have terrible relationships. We had sort of non-existent, mostly, relationships with most white people of Selma, other than the physicians. And we maintained good relationships with the white physicians.
What went into the planning of the march? Like, how far in advance did you become aware that there was going to be this march on Selma?
Well, the voter registration efforts began in the earlier 60s, 62, 63, and a young SNCC organizer named Bernard Lafayette came to Selma. And I've since learned more reading about him and hearing him speak than I knew at the time. But the name Bernard Lafayette was on the lips of many of our nurses. So I knew the name without ever seeing the person. But he was organizing mass meetings to educate people about their right to vote and to help them learn nonviolent resistance and really become ready to register to vote or to attempt to register to vote. Now that was a very brave thing to be doing in Selma. One of the things people told him that no other organizer wanted to come to Selma because the black people are too scared and the white people are too mean. And that kind of summed up what many people thought about the chances of a civil rights movement or voting rights movement happening or succeeding in Selma. But nonetheless, it went on and there were mass meetings and we heard about them. We saw one of the first ones taking place at the Baptist Tabernacle next to us. Many of the black ministers were too fearful of retribution from the white community to allow a mass meeting. So the Pastor Anderson from the Tabernacle Baptist hosted the first mass meeting. And we saw people coming to them. We saw that it was very well attended. And if we stood on the radiator in my bedroom, we could look across into the windows of the Tabernacle Church and see a little bit and hear some, we couldn't really hear what was being said. We could hear them singing. And at the end of the meeting, or at some point during it, we heard a lot of cars going by and then stopping. And we looked out our front windows and there were cars on both sides of the street, almost as far as you could see, and white men standing with clubs. We later found out that Sheriff Jim Clark of Dallas County had deputized men from 3 different counties to come and stand guard and be sure there was no violence, which would have come from them, as people left the meeting. And it was a very peaceful meeting. People left extremely peacefully. We watched them come out, and I was just sure I was going to see people beaten and killed in front of us. People simply walked out and walked back to their streets, their homes, with the utmost dignity and calm. It was just a stunning thing to see.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. I'm going to come back to you. I want to now go to Sister Regina Cowell. Sister Regina, at the time of you deciding to go to Selma, you were a teacher at the Sacred Heart Academy. Is that true?
That's right.
And so ultimately, what made you decide to go down to Selma, and what did it involve in terms of the congregation and getting permission?
Well, Sister Eucharia and I were the only 2 sisters who were members of the Catholic Interracial Conference. So when they were looking for religious people to go to Selma, we were the 2 that they invited and were eager and delighted to be involved. And getting permission was very easy. The congregation was very supportive. The diocese was supportive. We had, well, at Sacred Heart, the father of one of my students was the president of his union, and he wanted to pay to get me down there. Now, I don't know whether he was trying to get rid of me or he really wanted to help me, but I'm sure he wanted to help the process. When we were going down, when we hit the air, as soon as we hit the southern part of the country, people started to curse and yell at us and throw small objects at us. And when we got to Selma, we were ushered to Brown's Chapel, where all of the religious people had gathered. And it seems to me that the presence of the sisters, we were still in the habit then, the presence of the sisters announced that the Catholic Church was there. Now, there were priests and brothers there, but they could hardly be distinguished from the Protestant ministers. But when nuns showed up, they knew that we were there. When we were in Brown's Chapel, they gave us instructions how to protect yourself. If there was tear gas used, you were to crouch down and hide your face as best you could, trying not to breathe it in. And if people started to hit us at all, to make it cover your face and your head with your hands. Now, none of that was necessary because nobody wanted to see nuns getting whacked on the 7 o'clock news. So they were very careful. As I see it, Martin Luther King had 2 images that he wanted to project for the American people. One of them was what you believe about God has to do with racism. Racism tells us what we think God demands of us. And that was why he invited religious people down, to make this a religious problem. The second thing I think he wanted American people to see was how viciously Black people were beaten, which would not have happened if we were with the Black people who were trying to go over the bridge. There were really 2 separate Selma marches. Religious people, mostly white, very well organized and somewhat protected. And then Black people who were viciously beaten. So I think that Martin Luther King wanted to get both of those images out. Racism has to do with God, and Black people are being viciously attacked, terribly beaten. So those 2 images, at that time we thought that it would change the whole culture of the country. As we know now, racism is still a terrible, awful problem in this country. And I'm wondering if all that's going on now is going to make more change than what happened when we were in Selma. I would like to say one thing to my sisters in Rochester. I'd like to share with you my memory of the hospital. The bishop at Selma had a very good reputation. He kept peace between the Black and white community and between the government and the people. And he wanted to keep that peaceful message going. So he said, priests, brothers and sisters of the Selma diocese could not march in Selma. The Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester, who I think are just so wonderful, they wonderfully show how Sisters of St. Joseph are and should be, as I think. They obeyed the bishop, and then they opened the hospital and set up soup and coffee and tea. They obeyed the bishop, they obeyed lawful authority, but then they obeyed their own conscience. And that is, I think, one of the most wonderful gifts they have given us. The hospital became a safe place to go in an area that seemed anything but safe. So I thank them.
And thank you, Regina. And with that, I'm just gonna go back to Barbara. Can you tell us a little bit more about the bishop?
Well, about the bishop, I think Regina said it well, that he tried to keep peace between black and white. I think his dream was not ever of integration or a different society, but he also forbade us to march. And I, for me, the thought of leaving our post at the hospital at that time, that was such a critical time. It wasn't even in my thinking that I wanted to do anything but be at the hospital. And I think the other sisters shared that. The hospital was what we were doing, and that's why we were there. And if we did anything to jeopardize that, that would have been a terrible thing for the Black people of that whole area. So we did not march. No, we were very well aware of his saying we couldn't march, and had not much response to that other than, well, that's how it is. But we are we are at our post for a different reason than simply obeying an order from the bishop.
I know John Lewis, whenever he meets Sisters of St. Joseph, is very, very grateful for them. Can you tell us a little bit about his story in Selma?
Well, the bravest and most peaceful person, I think, of our generation, I think, is John Lewis, or at least one of them. My experience of John Lewis was hearing his name from staff. I was working in the emergency room on Bloody Sunday, which I want to just backtrack a little bit and say Bloody Sunday came about as a direct response to the death of another Black man, Jimmie Lee Jackson, as a result of a night march attacked by state troopers near to Selma, Marion, Alabama. And he was protecting his elderly grandfather and his mother from troopers who were beating them, and one of the troopers shot him in the stomach. He was at Good Samaritan Hospital and died there, I'm sad to say, 8 days later. But during the time that he was in the hospital, I visited him every day, and every day he did the same thing. He took my hand and said, "Sister, don't you think this is a high price to pay for freedom?" Which of course I do. And I think as a direct result of Jimmie Lee Jackson's death, the plan for a march on Montgomery for voting rights began. And the first attempt was on March 7th, which turned out to be Bloody Sunday, with the confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was extremely violent and aimed toward anybody in that group that was identified as a leader. So John Lewis absolutely stood out as a leader of the march, and he was mercilessly beaten about the head, had a fractured skull, and many other injuries, and was hospitalized. Now, I have told him to this day, I am not sure who took care of him. I saw him in the hall as he was on a stretcher, unconscious and ready to be taken up, admitted into a bed in the hospital. And over, anybody who was passing in the hall would say to me, "That's John Lewis." And I immediately was back in the knowing he was cared for, I was back in the emergency room. But I have to say, in the 1960s, we sisters were relatively sheltered, at least in Selma, from being involved in politics. I mean, we followed in the newspaper what was happening, but we were kind of removed. We were almost cloistered between the hospital and work. That was pretty much our life. But I worked with a doctor in the emergency room. Felt like we were being overcome ourselves with tear gas, which was very unpleasant. And the doctor that I was working with kept saying to every one of the people as he was stitching them up or helping them in whatever way, "I know it wasn't you that would have started this. It's the outside agitators." And think he was so firm in his belief that what would be the reason that a Selma native who was a man of color, a woman of color, would be dissatisfied with the way things were. I mean, it was so, it would have been laughable, except the situation was so serious.
Thank you, Barbara, so much. I appreciate all your input. One of the questions I'd like to bring Virginia Dowd, the archivist from Brentwood. Virginia, you have often talked about some hate mail that Mother Immaculata, who was the General Superior during this time. Can you say a little bit more about the letters she received?
Well, I should say that there were more congratulatory letters than there were hate letters.
Okay.
But the hate mail was so venomous. It's something that doesn't, you know, you can easily forget. By the way, this is Mother Immaculata right behind me, the one on the left. Let me just, I have a quote here from one of the congratulatory letters first that I want to say. Someone wrote, "It is a proud day when we realize that we are in a community so geared to our times that the permission to march was obtainable." And let me go to the venomous letters. So Sister Regina received one, and I quote, "Your trip to Selma, Alabama, in my opinion, was a disgraceful shame. You associated yourself with a race whose majority are vulgar savages." And another letter. "When I saw your picture in the Daily News with the accompanying article referring to the infamous Selma March, I thought, gosh, I must send that poor, misled, duped woman of God some literature. I do hope you have the intellectual honesty to read all the literature. Let's face it, the civil rights movement was started by communists, is now being led by communists, and will always be led by communists in the future." And Sister Eucharia got a short one. "You are a disgrace to the white race and to us Catholics. Shame on you." Now, most of the letters that were written were anonymous, but there was one in which a woman actually signed her name and gave her address, and Mother Immaculata was able to respond. So let me read the letter first. "Dear Mother Superior, I strongly oppose your religious and all others who will get mixed up in civil rights. You, their leader, permit them to parade in public and go to Selma. Your breed is new to me. I am a product of 12 years of St. Joseph nun education, and I remember when the rules were so strict as to ban TVs, movies, etc. For every rabble-rouser, anti-God individual that you attract, you lose 10 individuals like me. I have lost respect for the habit. To me, you are like anyone else." Mother Immaculata responded, "We wish to acknowledge receipt of your letter, which strongly opposed the Christian action of our sisters who, as members of the Catholic Interracial Council, took part in the demonstration at Selma. In keeping with the spirit of our beloved and saintly Pope John, we are becoming more and more aware of the need for those who profess loyalty to Christ to translate their theories into action. For too long a time, we have been sheltered from the social problems. It is our role now to be witnesses wherever our presence can further the ends of justice and charity. You may be interested in knowing that for every note of disapproval of our part in Selma, we have received many letters of commendation. And far from them being the rabble-rousers, they have come from priests, professional people, and those who are seriously committed to the cause of liberty for all."
Wow, thank you, Virginia. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Donna, Sister Donna, if you would tell us a little bit about your own experiences bringing students down to Selma in the past 20 years.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Thank you. I first took a group to Selma in 1986. I had just come back from El Salvador, and I remember thinking I was grateful for that experience because it prepared me a little bit for the experience of being in rural Alabama, and in terms of the dire poverty of persons of color, and the isolation. I remember being in the rural community in which I took students to work on a family's home, a mom with 6 children who would have to take jugs to walk to a long distance to a gas station to get clean water for drinking water, because the wells had been contaminated with different herbicides or poisons in the ground. And how she lived in literally a shack with no running water and one electric bulb hanging from the ceiling. And I mean, she was paying rent for this place with holes in the floor. And in fact, one of our sisters said, "Could you fix this floor, Sister Mary?" And I said, "Well, let me see." And I remember kneeling down and looking in the hole in the floor and realized I was looking at a bunch of eyes looking back at me with a nest of rats. So that here she is with these small children and having to contend with that kind of environment. What I discovered with this, and you saw this over and over, I mean, even to today, fortunately, there was Alabama Rise, or you can speak to that, Kathy, but the School of Nursing, and was it in Birmingham? Or I believe, was trying to figure out how to support elderly staying in their homes in Alabama. And one of Sister Mary brought up, well, there's no clean water. And it's really hard for someone elderly to get water, drinkable water. And they were mystified to think that here we are by now it's in the 90s, that people don't have access to clean water. And they were able to get a grant, I believe, from the Kellogg Foundation, which generally serves developing nations. But rural Alabama was considered a developing nation, so to speak, and was able to secure funds to bring water into homes. So that was a real eye-opener for students, our high school and college students whom I would take down to see the disparity between their living and the living of students like themselves. One of the last groups I took down, I remember Kathy was part of that, having us have a hot dog roast together. And the students didn't have sports, they didn't have after-school activities. One of the schools where our sisters helped out, the leach fields, the sewage was coming back into the school. They literally had to evacuate that school and occupy a school that had already been condemned. That was the kind of situation in terms of commitment to education, in particular for children who were poor and children who were African American. When integration took place, we saw that the tax level dropped so that there wasn't a support for education in southern states. And so the white community instead opened their own, what we called academies, and supported themselves so as not to have integration. Now, I took the groups that I generally took were from our own high school, which were pretty integrated girls' high school. I think somewhat like your high schools in Brentwood. And, best friends were black and white for my kids. And the last group I took, there were 9 girls, and girls on a bus from Rochester to Selma, they're all buddy, and everyone I said to Maurice, they kept asking me, what kind of a team is this? And I was like, team? I said, well, they're from the same high school. But everywhere I went, and then I realized there was no context to have black and white youth together unless they were on some kind of sport team. There was no concept that they could be friends or that they share lives together. And when I was in Vredenburg, the head of the center for children there said, your youth give me hope that maybe someday my youth might have a white friend, that maybe we begin to create harmony through relationships and friendships, and you give image to that. So our students, I know our students here in Rochester, it was such an eye-opener experience that they were transformed, and definitely wanted, they shared their stories here with other students, and to the point where they became active in relations here in Rochester, and wanting to stay established in relationship to the students and the events in the South too. So it was really a conscientizing experience for all of us. I mean, one of the great things in Selma is there's some really great museums and groups that will meet with students and to tell their story. There's one gentleman who was simply a elementary age student, because if parents got arrested, they would lose their jobs. So it was the youth that often protested or marched. And to talk about being arrested as an 11-year-old, I mean, the kind of courage on the behalf of families to just for the right to vote, the right to have safe housing or health care, and I mean, all the things we take for granted in our community. So it really was an education, and as I said, I hope a conscientizing for advocates to be allies for justice. I know a lot of the students that participated, I know they're very much involved with Black Lives Matter. I see them, I connect with them all over the world on Facebook, and I'm so proud of them. But it does take an experience just to help us to see the injustice and 400 years of, we have a new form of slavery in this day and age. It just takes on a different look than it.
Well, Donna, thank you very much for sharing with us, and we'll come back to you. And I'd like to now just spend a little time with Kathy, Sister Kathy, who has spent the last 20 years in Selma. Sister Kathy, you are unmuted, yes?
Yes.
Thank you. So tell us, what has been your experience of the past 20 years in Selma?
I'm sort of sad listening to Donna. So there's, other than mobile homes in Reddenburg, the housing is a little better, but not great. I was trying to tie the task that I do with civil rights, and I really see that as empowering the local communities, and I'm mostly with Black communities because we are segregated, but giving them a vision and letting them know that there's alternatives, and these alternatives are within their reach. And then since for 30 years, I think, the Alabama Arise is our biggest, it's a group of about 160 groups, churches, like League of Women Voters and individuals who actually come to our area, listen to the needs, help them to determine solutions for themselves, and then on a state level, decide on issues, and then help us go back to Montgomery, our capital, and lobby ourselves. They walk us right through that, and we do that every year so that we can bring those who have no voice, to give them a voice and let them speak to their representatives. So that's one of the really great things that are happening in the state. But after the Good Samaritan, after integration with the voting, the Good Samaritan, the Black hospital closed, so that again, Blacks had to go to the white hospital. We're allowed to, but it was the Blacks that had to make the move. Same with the school. Our Black school closed and they came to the white. Same with our church, our Black church. We still have our Black church for daily mass, the traditional St. Joseph's Chapel of the Edmondites, but the main church, they moved into the white, and we've renamed it Queen of Peace. So in Pineapple, after integration, after that, Father Roger, the head of the Edmondite mission, sent the sisters out to the rural area to identify the needs. And they had an healthcare, an educator, and an outreach worker. And I've always been the outreach worker. That means we just do community organizing or whatever. So in Pineapple, we had the Carondelet sisters, Sister Jane Kelly, who's still here in Selma, and Sister Dr. Roseanne Cook, who had the clinic in Pineapple. And they received, I did the patient assistance program because they received medicines and financial assistance. When I moved on to Vredenburg, I live with Chambray sisters from Connecticut, and we started youth groups. We partnered with the Notre Dame sisters out of Baltimore, and we hired local AmeriCorps people, and our program was CHIP, Children of Incarcerated Parents. And what we did was mentor a program, and we had the young adults with the youth, and we found out the adults had never had a childhood and not a very good education either. So we did a lot of field trips, a lot of experiencing. When it came to Selma, our big thing for the Admonite missions is food. We do 1,000 meals in about a dozen different ways a day. So that food has been always a big part of Selma, but now we've partnered again with the Sisters Initiative, the Hilton Fund for the sisters. Mm-hmm. And that's how we've started our academy, which is grades 8 to 10, and we strive with academics and college and career, giving them opportunities so that they can imagine something beyond Selma and beyond this rural area. Sister Pat Flask also lives with me and works with me, and she, with her program, she invites sisters and associates, friends down to experience the poverty, and so that when they go home, they'll have maybe a handle on how to help at home. Today I'm having, this afternoon, my 9th graders in Selma are going to be tutoring my rural students through Zoom. So I'm having, at least I have Black role models here in Selma who are working with the kids in my rural areas, because the school systems are terrible. Just 70% 4th graders below level, 8th graders 80% below level. So,
Kathy, I'm going to ask you this question, and then after your response, anyone else on the panel who would like to join in. You know, as someone who lived through the 60s and was an adult and was ministering, that at that time seemed to be such a watershed moment. And now these past 4 months, initially as a result of COVID-19, which made us aware of how disproportionately this virus was affecting and killing members of the brown and Black communities. And then in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, we saw the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you think, you know, after 55 years, we're finally getting it? Do we, you know, what happened in those 55 years that we didn't go all the way? These issues of institutional racism continue to exist in all institutions. So what do you think about, what's sort of your gut experience of what's happening now in this country and even in Europe?
I'm very excited about what's happening in the country, but again, we don't see it very much here in the South right now. We're a Republican state, and we're hoping even before the COVID virus, we still have we have a Black leadership, but it's very dysfunctional, maybe because of the education system in the past. So we're looking forward to elections. We have elections for the city in August and then of course in November, but we're hopeful, but it's not happening here. That's what I see.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel respond? Regina?
Yes, I think that as we think of the past couple of weeks and the marches now, It is a loud message that we did not come very far from Selma. That racism, the sin of racism, is still very strong in this country. I would like to say a few words about the Sisters of St. Joseph. I went to Bishop McDonald, which is a high school that had a number of religious communities, not just one. The Dominicans taught math and science, so I thought they were the smartest ones. The Mercies did art and music, so I thought they were elegant. But the Sisters of St. Joseph did everything. And that's pretty much the message when we came from France. One of their supporters sent a letter to the bishop saying, don't restrict these women, they can do anything. And in bishops, they taught religion, Latin, English. They were the administrators, they did everything. They ran the yearbook, the newspaper, the debate society. They could do anything and were known and are still known as Sisters of the Neighborhood. Recently, Pope Francis gave a different interpretation of that image of Jesus knocking on the door. I'm sure you've seen that picture.
Yes.
And pretty much it was translated that Jesus was knocking on the door of our hearts, which we've closed off to him. What Francis suggests is Jesus is knocking from inside the church, trying to get out into the world. And I would like to think that some sister of St. Joseph taught him that. That has been our history. We found God and we help people to understand and to find God in the dailiness of life, in the ordinary, in the supermarket and the playground and the homes. So
where is the Sister of St. Joseph now in the Black Lives Matter movement?
Sisters of St. Joseph are there, right in the guts of the movement, learning from other people and helping to teach them both, so that we are there, but not trying to take over what is particularly a movement that is and should be led by Black people themselves, that we should learn from. And I think that's pretty much where we are. On the streets, in the neighborhood. Jesus said, love your neighbor. And where do you find your neighbor? Not necessarily in church or the synagogue, but you find your neighbor in the neighborhood. And that's who we are. We are in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you. Donna or Barbara or Virginia, any comment?
One quick comment. I came across, going back to the march in Selma, I came across an editorial this morning from the National Catholic Reporter in March of 1965. And they said, the appeal from church leaders asking for the sisters' help stressed most heavily the role of the sisters as peacemakers.
Wow, thank you. Yes, reconcilers. Yes.
A big piece for us is a ministry of presence, to be allies. I mean, I have been formed by the people I've stood with over these many, many years, and to recognize that we have to be students and listeners. And I think that's a big piece that sometimes people just think it's over. We've done it and now move on. The reality is this is a life's work of creating relationships and equality for each other. I never thought it would be this bad. you know, I had great hope when President Obama was elected, and I thought that was a sea change then. And what I didn't realize is exposed the deep-seated racism and evil that divides us, and it continues to be so dividing. And so how is it that we work as bridge builders, healers of the this whole separation? And, you know, like Isaiah, you know, menders of the I can't think of the scripture right now, but just to be menders, and we do that together. We cannot do that for each other. We have to do with each other. And so that's one example I think that we can provide, as Regina said. People have the right and should be. I mean, I work in the criminal justice system, and that in itself needs to be dismantled. I mean, the four big things are: I go in, no one looks like me. All people are poor. Many have mental illness and are self-medicating with street drugs. And we say, what, you know, the attitude about persons who've been incarcerated, which we've created a continuation of the enslavement of people. So there's so many places that we have got to work on, and never give up, never stop. That's the thing. We stop. I can go into the Black community, and I have, and lived and worked. But in my community or in the white community, there's only one direction, you know. And how do we get rid of these red lines? How do we provide decent education? I mean, if you look at Alabama, what are you, 49 out of 50? I think Mississippi's 50, something like that. I mean, it's sinful. Social sin is abounding. So we have to bring attention to it and stand with it, and stand with each other to keep trying to bring about justice and equality and the peaceable kingdom.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. And Barbara, if we could finish up with you, any last comments?
Well, I was thinking about two things that we experience in our convent, in the neighborhood where we live. Number one, we have a sign out in front of the convent and a little table with a box. The sign says, "We are praying for you," or something like that. Yeah. And the box is for people to put their intentions in. And we have gotten some very heartrending intentions. And we pray every morning when we pray, whenever we gather in prayer. We pray for the people who are asking for our prayers. And the second thing is, in our neighborhood, which is not a really poor neighborhood, in fact, it's considered an up-and-coming neighborhood, but there are signs, just bountiful signs that say Black Lives Matter. And I'm so encouraged by that, hoping there's action behind those signs, that people are going to vote and people are meeting and whatever we need to be doing to change the dynamic that has gone on for way, way too long. I was thinking about Jimmie Lee Jackson, the young Black man who died in Alabama, as he was the George Floyd of the 1960s. And I think we have much more hope. I think we're pinning our hopes that people will not forget all of the Black lives that matter. George Floyd and too many others, and that has got to change. Okay. And it's got to change with education, it's got to change with housing, it's got to change with opportunity, all of those things together.
Yes.
And maybe let me close this part with John Lewis's quote, that the vote is to him, the vote is the single most important nonviolent tool that we have. And I do believe that.
That's beautiful, Barbara. Thank you. And a thank you to our panel, Virginia Dowd, Sister Regina Kahl, Sister Kathleen, Sister Donna, and Sister Barbara. And for all of those of you who have joined us, I'd like to just close by saying that a popular read, I just received my copy the other day of a book that people have been encouraged to read. It's called White Fragility. And I think, as some of the sisters brought up, it is important that we educate ourselves, and we are in relationship with members of the Black and Brown community to listen to their story and hear their experiences. And so again, I thank everyone for their participation today. And certainly we pray that things moving forward, that we will all take up a commitment to end racism in our hearts, in our communities, in our country. So thank you again.
Thank
God
you for
bless.
having us.